We are human beings who use our brains and muscles to shape, to control our environment, and to take care of ourselves. And to make a long story short, we work. We went to work as individuals or very small groups, used our brains and muscles to produce the goods and services we consumed. We grew the vegetables. We cared for the animals. What has happened over the history of the human race is how we've organized that. We've done that very differently. For example, for much of the history of the human race, human beings did this individually or in very small groups, a family. Then at a certain point in human history, something monumental happened. Many reasons, and we call that nowadays a division of labor. It stopped being the case that everybody produced all of what he or she needed. And the distribution happens through lots and lots of individual bargainings. That's called a market system, human beings. And then the master, owning the slave, having dominion over the slave as a property, can treat that slave pretty much as he sees fit. And he says to the slave, I have an idea. You do all the work. You build the house, you make the shirt, you cook the omelet. And you do not only do that so that you yourself can survive, that is, you cook an omelet, you eat, you make a shirt, you wear, that's fine. But you're going to have to do, ready, more than that. You're going to have to do more work than is what taking care of you, because that's what you're going to have to give to me, which will allow me to have an omelet, a shirt, and a chair, and I'm not going to do nothing. You'll do it for me, or else I'm the master. It's a very peculiar arrangement, because it means that right in the production process, instead of us all getting together to work together to produce what we all need, we are introducing a big new difference. Conflict, tension, anger, resentment. Why? Because some people are doing all the work and producing more than they get. A more that we nowadays call the surplus, the extra. What is produced by workers when they produce more than they themselves consume. Slaves produce a surplus that masters get. Masters use it not only to have a lovely lifestyle, but to make sure that this system continues because they like it. The surplus, the extra, what is produced by workers when they produce more than they themselves consume. Slaves produce a surplus that masters get. Masters use it not only to have a lovely lifestyle, but to make sure that this system continues because they like it. But the slaves don't. Not so much. And the reason shouldn't be hard for you to figure out. They're getting, to use a technical term in economics, screwed. Big time. Third arrangement, different. Here again, it's interesting. Some people produce a surplus other people get. But the people producing the surplus are not slaves. They're nobody's property. We call this kind of a system with a different name, just to keep it clear in our minds. We call it feudalism. It's sort of what existed in Europe from around 500 AD to around 1500 AD. No more slaves, nobody owns anybody. But a serf is a person who gets born in a particular piece of land and by custom, by religion, by the law, stays there. Your people, as the child of a serf, you are therefore also a serf, and you owe an obligation to the Lord, to some big shot in the area. Those of you who have ever visited Europe, you'll make tourism your activity, you'll be taken to chateaus. That's the French word for, in English, castle, or a German word, Schloss. Like, these are different words, but they're about where the Lord lived, the feudal lord. And here's how it worked. If you were a serf, you worked 3 days on the land, and the fruit of that work you did was yours to keep. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you went to another piece of land and you worked that was the land of the Lord. And whatever you produced those second 3 days was his. You went back home. And on the seventh day, you rested. And you know what institution presided over that? The Roman Catholic Church in Europe presided over feudalism. You went to church on the seventh day, and you rested. And then you resume next week. So the serfs produced in the first 3 days for themselves. In the second 3 days, the surplus that allowed those chateaus to look so grand. You ever been to Versailles outside of Paris? You'll see just how grand it can be if you have hundreds of thousands of serfs working for you, which Louis XIV, or whichever one it was, had when he built the chateau at Versailles. Now we come to the next. Just notice, these are different ways in which we have specialization, and we have production organized in different arrangements among human beings. Feudalism was overthrown after 1,000 years. It lasted a long time. Overthrown 1500, 1600, 1700s. About when? In Europe. Overthrown. The serfs had it. The problems of the lords, together with the anger and resentment of the serfs, blew the thing up. The most famous moment, the French Revolution of 1789, when the angry masses of the French people grabbed Marie Antoinette out of her castle, her feudal castle, and cut off her head to make a point. And it happened in other parts of Europe as well. And a new system came in. And this new system we now call capitalism. It's the one we still have. It's about 300 or 400 years old. That's all. Which, as systems go, is kind of young. Been around a while. How does it work? Well, it's different from slavery because we don't allow people to own one another. And it's different from serfdom because we don't say if you're born over here to a serf, that's it, you're a serf too. We allow much more, and this is very big, individual liberty and mobility. No matter who you're born to, do what you can. And here's how that system works. Everybody looks for what he or she is going to do. Those of you that are young are in that process now. Where am I going to go to school? What am I going to study? What course am I going to take? Who am I going to study? What credential, what mechanism to find a place in the division of labor? What am I going to do? Some of you worry a lot about it. You even pay people to advise you how to do it. You go to an institution that promises you that if you go there and you do real well and you take the exams and you get the course credit and you get the degree, then you'll get a job. That's not happening anymore, but many of you haven't figured that out yet, and the hope of the system is you never will. But the smarter ones among you have already noticed, and the rest of you will find out soon enough. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. How does this capitalist system work? It's interesting. Here's how it works. The vast mass of people, here we go now, look for a job, which, by the way, they take as axiomatic, as the way life is. Even though, in fact, if you follow what I've said, that's not been the way life is at all. The child of a slave knew exactly what he or she was going to do, didn't need a school, didn't need an advisor, they were going to be a slave too, likely to the same master or the children of the master. The serf knew where he, she would be, what their lives would be like. No confusion there. No anguished adolescence trying to figure out what I'm going to do with myself. No problem. Capitalism brings you that dilemma because it's kind of open-ended. So you go around looking for a job. Now let's look at that for a minute. When you look for a job, you're actually looking for someone to do something to, with, for, or at you. I'll leave it to you to decide which preposition to use. You look for a boss. You look for someone to do something remarkable with you, to hire you, to engage you, to employ you. A serf never did that. A slave never did that. People who got together collectively did it. Nobody hired anybody else for the vast majority of the history of the human race. That is a very peculiar arrangement. And here's how it goes. You go to an employer, you say, here I am. I just graduated from MIT. Look at how white my teeth are. Please give me a job. I am very good at whatever. And you hope the employer will do that. That's why you went there. You're having an interview. And you have a conversation. And you talk about the work you'll be expected to do, the work you would like to do, all of that bullshit. And then you come to the key moment. How much am I going to get paid? Because you need the money. Why? Because you need to buy a lot of things in order to avoid painful death. Food you need. You don't grow that yourself. Other than the little pot with the 4 arugula plants, you don't have much, right? So you need food, you need underpants because it's polite, and all the rest of the things you need. And you don't make those yourselves, most of you, so you need money to acquire them. And the job you're going to get is going to give you the money to buy the things that will allow you to survive at least and have a pleasant life, maybe, if you're lucky, at best. So you enter into that key part of the conversation. How much, dear Mr. or Ms. Employer, are you going to give me? And this is a very interesting moment. And let's say you agree on something. Let's say you agree to be paid $20 an hour, or an annual salary that works out to $20 an hour, or 30, or it doesn't make any difference, but let's stay with 20. It's a nice round number. So the employer agrees to pay you $20 an hour. And you must agree in return to do a number of things. That's how this system works. Number one, you agree to come 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. You have to come. You have to be reasonably well dressed. You have to be able to apply your brains and muscle. And you have to be willing to do what you're told to do with whatever the raw materials are there for you to work on and whatever tools and equipment are there for you to work with. And one more thing, really crucial. At the end of the 8 hours, typically, that you've used your brains and muscles in the way you've been told to, on the raw materials you've been given, you will have transformed those raw materials. Remember what I said at the beginning. Something provided by nature, you will have worked up into something else. Whatever the product is that your employer produces, a good or a service, whichever. And here comes the crucial thing. At the end of the day, that your work is embedded, embodied in the finished product that you've been told to produce, you must go home and leave the product of your work there. You made it, but you don't get it. And if you take a little of it home with you, the employer calls those men in blue uniforms and they come to your house and they hurt you to help you understand, no. You make this stuff, then you go home. At home, you drink beer, take off your shoes, go to sleep watching boring television so that you're in shape tomorrow morning to do it all again. Okay? The employer takes the fruits of your labor and the employer decides what to do with it. Now, the most important point of all. The only way, the only time, the only circumstance on which an employer will ever give you $20 an hour, or 30, or 60, or 100, doesn't make any difference. One condition has to be met. During that hour that the employer pays you X worth of money, your labor has to produce for the employer more than X worth of extra stuff for him to sell. Why? Because otherwise there's nothing in it for him. If he pays you $20 an hour, and your hour's worth of work produces another $20 worth of whatever the product of that company is, which he sells for $20, what's he got? He sold for $20, used the money to pay you, he's got squat. And much as he likes you and his fellow man and woman, it's not going to happen. So there's one condition in capitalism under which you will get a job. You will have to produce more for your employer than the employer pays you. So for those of you that have been saying to one another, I'm not going to work for anybody who doesn't pay me what I'm worth. You don't understand this system. That's not going to happen. You're in the wrong country at the wrong time historically. That's more likely for you to be hit by lightning than to discover that situation. You are always going to be ripped off in your job in capitalism because that's the way the system works. But don't worry, there are a lot of people, including lots of economics professors, who will give you one story after another instead of what I just told you, so that you don't get distressed while you're being ripped off, because it might make you resist, which we can't have that. But in capitalism, it turns out we've got exactly the same kind of system as we had in slavery and feudalism. Why? Because the worker has to produce more, a surplus, than he gets, which goes to somebody else. It's the employer who sells the hour's worth of output you helped produce for $40 and pays you $20. And what's left over, he gets, just as the master got the surplus the slave produced, or the feudal lord got the surplus that the serf produced. One of the great insights of the most profound thinkers about capitalism is that capitalism wasn't the end of slavery or feudalism, it's a changed form of them. No more slave, no more serf, but surplus being produced by one part of the population, enabling another part to live off of it, that hasn't changed at all. And that means what also hasn't changed is in the heart of the capitalist system is a conflict, a tension, an opposition, a resentment, an anger, and a bitterness between those who are constantly producing more than they get and those who live off that difference. And if you're a capitalist, an employer, what of course is your interest? To give the worker the least possible while getting the most out of them, because that's the biggest surplus they can get. And the more surplus they have, the more secure they'll be. It's the same problem the slave master had in relationship to the slave, or the feudal lord in relationship to the serf. So for those of you that have already worked in your lives and wondered why, at the end of many a day, you felt somehow ripped off, it's because you were. And if you tried to find a place where you could shake off this sense of being ripped off, you found one. The neighborhood tavern that offered you at the end of your day a happy hour that you know was there and given that name precisely because it was in a remarkable way different from all the preceding hours, wasn't it? So even a society like ours that doesn't want to face or admit any of this does it despite itself, can't help itself. Capitalism is a system premised on what Marx called exploitation, which he defined very simply and very carefully. Exploitation exists if and when the people who do the work produce a surplus that other people get and distribute as they see fit. That's why slavery is one kind of exploitation, feudalism is another, and capitalism is a third. What's the alternative? I already told you at the beginning of this little monologue. That's when the people who produce the surplus, the workers, are themselves the people who get the surplus. How would that work? Take any factory, take any office, take any store in America today, here in New York. Change it as follows. No more board of directors. Most things are done by corporations that are run by a board of directors. No more board of directors. Don't need it. Here's how we're going to do it. Monday to Thursday, where all the workers come to work and do what they were always doing. You cook bread, you clear the table, you set the table, you do the dishes, whatever, if it's a restaurant, say. Friday, we have a different arrangement. You come to work, half of you, and you do your regular job. And the other half of you sit around making the decisions. The menu, the investment, the all the decisions that used to be made by the capitalist, the boss. The following week, the group of you that had meetings all day Friday last week, you do the work in the restaurant, and the other half of the workers have a meeting instead where they go over these decisions. Workers become their own board of directors. Workers become their own capitalists. Or to say the same thing another way, the worker-capitalist division dissolves. Is that an alternative? Of course it is. Do we have examples of that in history? Loads. Do we have examples of that in the United States today? Loads. Do we understand it as an alternative to capitalism? No, 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 no. No, 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 no. People like me, our economics professors, are very carefully trained to avoid explaining any of this to you. That's what we are. I don't say this for the obvious reasons that you will expect, but I will tell you. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and my PhD in economics is from Yale. So I'm a poster boy for the education I just described. Major mediocre. An education designed to give you a very different understanding of how this system works from the one I just gave you. The one I just gave you comes from the work of Karl Marx. Uh-oh. Comes from the work of Karl Marx. Uh-oh. And in my education, we were kept as far away from Karl Marx as you were from certain parts of the town you grew up in where you were supposed to never go, especially not in the evening. And for us, Marx was, I don't know if any of you saw it, I was on that television program last week, Charlie Rose, and he asked me questions about my education at those institutions, and he could not believe, because he didn't want to, that I didn't get much of an education in Marxism, exactly zero in those places, because they were afraid. Marxism tells you this is a system that leaves a lot to be desired and has an awful lot of problems. Whereas we're supposed to believe, aren't we, that we live in an economic system that really is about the best thing since sliced bread, works like a charm, is the best thing the human being could ever come up with, and therefore, shut up. Well, it's one way of organizing an education, but it's not the one that I like. In 2007, the number of people officially counted unemployed in the United States was about 7.5 million. Today, that number is 15 million. You notice anything? It got worse. Over the last 4 years, several million Americans have been thrown out of their homes by a legal procedure called foreclosure, which means in America today we have a remarkable achievement of capitalism. On the one hand, several millions of people who are homeless, and on the other hand, several million homes that are empty. They stare at each other. There's efficiency for you. Fantastically fertile soil, wonderful climate, 2 oceans, lots of harbors, rich with rivers, full of fish and game, and they're wonderful. So capitalists who came here, people who came here wanted to start a business, were able to do it quickly and easily. Everything was in order with one exception. One thing wasn't here enough of: workers. This country had a perpetual labor shortage. And how did you get people from other parts of the world, particularly those parts from which the capitalists themselves came, Europe, to come here? Well, Americans solved the problem in 2 ways. For the southern half of the United States, the solution was African slavery. You brought the people here by buying them, by collecting them through military means and so on, and bringing them to the South. But for the rest of the country, the North, the Midwest, and remember the rest of the country wasn't settled then, you had to do it by raising wages. To make a foreigner in Europe rip up his life or her life, tear herself away from family, friends, culture, religion, geography, and everything else, to make a dangerous trip across the ocean to an unknown place, you've got to provide a lot of incentive to get people to do that in any numbers. So that was done by selling to the Europeans the idea in America you could start anew and you could do way better than anything you could hope for in your native country, which for 150 years was true. So that the letters sent back by the immigrants brought more immigrants because they validated this story. It turned out for the employer, not only do I have to raise the wages to bring them from Europe, but no sooner do they come here and they realize they can run off into the interior at any time. There's so much free land that they can become, once again, peasants, which is what most of them had been in Europe anyway. They knew how to do that. So you had to raise wages to bring them, and then you had to keep raising wages to keep them. So wages rose. And it worked for capitalists because the upper line, the line of productivity, how much output each worker produced, that was rising too, because people worked hard here, because immigrants were the kind of people who had the extra to come this distance to work real hard, because they were driven hard by their employers, and because they were paid well. They worked. So it was a nirvana capitalism. Rising productivity, rising wages. A capitalism in which both sides were doing real well, catching up and eventually overtaking the older capitalisms in England, above all. Wow. Believing you lived in a charmed country, better than anywhere else. Unbelievable opportunity for working people. You know it all because those of you that are Americans have grown up in that. And now you understand the historic roots. Try to imagine with me quickly then, what happens in the 1970s when all of this stops. And it stops in the 1970s because the labor shortage is over and it never comes back. So let's quickly see what happened. First, the computer. The computer, an important modern invention, replaces huge numbers of people. Think of a grocery store. You once needed an army of 50 inventory people to keep track of how many boxes of Rice Krispies moved off the shelf so you would know when to order more replacements. Now, as you all know, it scans by a computer as your Rice Krispie box goes across the scanner, and somebody sitting in Boise, Idaho can tell you how many boxes of Rice Krispies have to be sent to every grocery store in America, and it can tell you that on an hour-by-hour basis. Computers wiped out the need for millions of people. Number two, by the 1970s, American capitalists had an incentive, of course, to use computers. Because wages had been rising for 150 years, they were higher in America than any other capitalist had. And by the 1970s, the peculiar position of the United States after World War II, when we were the only capitalist country that was left, everything else had been destroyed by the war, that was over. The Japanese and the Germans led the recovery of our competitors. By the 1970s, they were competing. By the 1970s, Americans were getting used to learning new names for cars. Instead of Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler, they learned Toyota, Datsun, and all the rest. So Americans were worried. We're at a disadvantage because our workers get paid too much. Ha-ha! A computer. I get rid of the worker. Who needs the worker? I buy one computer, I can fire 50 high-priced workers. Second thing capitalists did, beside instituting computers, is to move production out of the United States. Big time. Where? To where workers hadn't had this experience, which is where? Everywhere else in the world. To take advantage of cheap labor. Why did they do that? That goes back to what I told you. Because the capitalist gets more surplus, the less he has to pay the workers for the work they do. So of course you move from here and reopen the factory in Shanghai. Of course, Starbucks is opening more new coffee shops in China than it is in the United States now. Of course. You know what you have to pay a coffee producer and a barista in Shanghai? More or less nothing. I mean, it's more than nothing, they have to live, but not much more. And by American standards, fantastic. So, two other things happen. Not only are jobs disappearing, because the computer and export of jobs is happening, but suddenly more Americans, or people in America, are looking for work. First, and most important, adult white women move into the paid labor force by the millions starting in the 1970s. Whether you call that women's liberation or you call that a changing culture or whatever you call it, there's a movement of a whole new part of our population who used to define themselves as mothers, homemakers, and wives and all of that, and they want a job now. They want a job out there in the world, just like the men do. So they're coming in huge numbers. And finally, we have yet another wave of immigration for a whole host of reasons, but not from Europe this time, mostly from Latin America. Coming in, looking for work, women looking for work at a time when the computer and export of jobs, the labor shortage is over. The supply of workers now exceeds the demand. And what does every capitalist do, whether or not he's ever gone to a business school? He realizes, I don't have to raise wages anymore, ever. I got loads of people who want a job and can't find one. If any of my workers complain that I've stopped raising wages, I say to them, have a nice day. There's 400 people out there who would take your job tomorrow. So be real quiet, and I won't slam the door on you. And you know something? Most employers don't have to tell that to workers. They already figured it out. Notice this line? That's the line of real wages in the United States. They stopped rising in the 1970s, and they never resumed again. Oh my God. An American people who believe they're in a promised land, a land cherished by God, where it's their birthright to do better, to have a higher standard of living, to promise their children the American dream, can't do it. Over and above what you get out of what you produce, that's the difference between these two lines. That's what the surplus is. That's what these lines measure. So the surplus goes nuts in the last 35 years. We have the greatest peacetime stock market boom we've ever had in our country. Of course, the stock market is the people who get pieces of this surplus. That's what they do when they buy and sell stocks. What do the capitalists do? They can't get over it. It's like they were born at the exact right moment. Or not born, but arrived at being the head of Dipsy Doodle Corporation, and this is as true on Wall Street as it is on Main Street, a distinction that only in the American imaginary could figure as important. Every capitalist took advantage of this. I don't have to pay my workers anymore because we don't have a labor shortage anymore, but I can get out of them as much as another computer and another pressure can generate. They all did that. The little ones with 6 workers, all of whom they know by their first name, and the big corporation with 10,000 employees. They all did it the same. They're all equally coupable. Number one, the capitalists looked at this situation and they were smart. They did not make the analysis I'm presenting to you. Because that would make them what? The leeches who cashed in on a social situation that made wages stop rising. They wouldn't like to think of themselves as leeches. Most people don't. So they came up with a different story. Ready? Here it was. The reason corporations are making all this mountain of money is because they're led by entrepreneurial geniuses. No, I mean this real seriously. Those of you that are a little bit older, you remember names like Lee Iacocca or Jack Welch. Iacocca was the head of Chrysler or Ford or one of them. Jack Welch was the head of GE. We began to have, in the 1970s and 80s, all these books about these fantastic corporate executives who were making all this money. They were telling a story that they did something. I always thought that was wonderful, because if it was their genius that was making money then, it must have been their stupidity that was preventing it back there. But that was an implication they didn't worry about. There was method to their madness, and madness it was. Because of course, if the reason the company is making a ton of money is the great leadership of the top executive, rather than the end of a labor shortage, then it would be reasonable for the top executive to say, pay me, because I'm the one who's making all the money. In the 1970s, the average of what a CEO got in relationship to the average wage of a worker was 43 to 1. Last year, it was over 400 to 1. You understand the difference? You understand the difference? Why? Why? Why is it so bad? That's the question I promised to answer. The final answer, besides all the analysis, is that there was a movement then. Roosevelt had to go to the rich because below was coming something very scary, not only demanding all these benefits, but threatening social change, economic criticism. They were making the concrete demand to debate and change the economic system. When the war was over, when the Depression had been overcome by the war, that half of the business and rich community that had never bought the threat from below, that were prepared to fight, didn't go with Roosevelt. They made sure to undo as their #1 priority the movement that had gotten Roosevelt to provide for people in the depths of the Depression. They went to destroy the labor movement, they went to destroy the socialist parties, and they went to destroy the Communist Party. And they have succeeded. Over the last 50 years, the labor movement has declined in its strength every single year. It's a line that looks like that. The AFL-CIO today represents less than 7% of private sector employees in the United States. It's done. You can't do anything. The socialist and communist parties are virtual. I mean, they exist, but their political influence is nothing compared to what it once was. They went after them. They destroyed them. And now the irony. The big historical question. Could capitalism have survived an 11-year depression in the 1930s had the leader not provided for people Social Security, unemployment compensation, and jobs? Would things have polarized, and then what? The argument that was always made was that the movement from below saved capitalism from its own excesses. If that's true, then you must wonder whether the system has now destroyed the only chance it has to avoid the cataclysm it avoided last time, because it destroyed the left that might have made this society handle this crisis in a different way. Europe is moving ever closer to the edge of a cliff. The United States is literally talking about a fiscal cliff at the end of this year, if you pay attention to these things. We have a capitalism that is spinning out of control to fix it. And it is now pushing ahead as if it doesn't have to deal with this problem. It can just go on. Occupy Wall Street is the first sign, the same mechanisms are reviving again. Nobody knows how that'll develop or where it'll go. But it's a very peculiar capitalism that produces these kinds of catastrophes and develops a politics that makes it uniquely incapable of handling its own problems. The only bad news in all of this is that you and I are living and have to live through this. And the only way to change it is if another movement from below can be created, either to reproduce what happened in the 30s, at least a softer, gentler depression, or the alternative that was avoided in the 30s, which is a final coming to terms with whether capitalism is indeed the best this country can do.